Hello, folks. Fakir here again online. Sabahat Ashraf, otherwise known as Fakir Online. I haven't been doing much on the video platforms for a while, and now hoping in the new year to come up with some interesting content and discussions. The journey is always about things I want to learn about and questions I have, and interesting people we can meet and ask about things they are doing and pursuing. Frankly, I look at it as people focusing and finding out things for the rest of us and then coming back and reporting to us. So, for today, we have with us Laura Miller, who is a scholar based here in the San Francisco Bay Area, pursuing a PhD in Islamic Studies at the, I would say, legendary Graduate Theological Union. Is Theological Union?
Yeah.
Yeah, what is known as the GTU, based in the Berkeley area. I think it has a relationship with the University of Berkeley, but it's an independent institution. So that space, there's been some very interesting study both at the GTU. Now we have Zaytuna in the same area, which is the first official, Muslim seminary in the U.S. what offers formal degrees. And Laura is here with us. So let me introduce Laura as a friend of mine. We are both members of the Muslims for Progressive Values, which is a progressive Muslim organization here. But in this space, we're here talking about our, the nerdy rabbit holes we end up in. And Laura has taken it to the next level. She signed up for a PhD. So, hi, Laura.
Hello. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, good evening. So here we are. So I had a basic introduction with you. And is there anything you want to add and expand that thought? And to get you started, I'd say, why a PhD in Islamic Studies? Why specifically the topic you have chosen, which we have defined as our topic today, Andalus? And I know you have some very specific things you're starting to hone down on, and it's exciting to hear that from you. So take it away.
Yeah. I think what initially drew me into wanting to do a PhD specifically on Al-Andalus, not just general Islamic studies or fiqh or theology, but specifically about this time and place, which is Al-Andalus after 1492. Because I feel like as a convert, I often don't feel like I can openly be Muslim. I didn't take on a Muslim name like Khadija or Fatima. Obviously, I don't wear hijab. And I know some Muslim converts do, but that's not the path that I chose. And for many different reasons, which is a whole other topic in and of itself. I don't really like to publicly flaunt my Islam, not with my non-Muslim family, not the workplace, really not anywhere else except with other Muslims, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And in Al-Andalus, I'm reading about an entire population that was once able to be loud and proud Muslim, especially in Granada, because Granada was the last piece of Iberia to fall to the Christians. But it had been majority Muslim, right? It was like the last holdout of Islam in Iberia. And so a little bit of background information. So Granada fell in 1492 to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And Ferdinand and Isabella had these capitulations that in theory were supposed to protect Granada's Muslims, grant them freedom of religion and all this good stuff. But they reneged on the capitulations. They didn't follow through. And by 1499, the clergy, not so much the monarchs per se, but the clergy, they were burning like thousands of Arabic books in public bonfires, and they forced the Muslims of Granada to become Christian. And not just the Muslims specifically in Granada, but by then Granada was subsumed into Castile. So all the Muslims in all of Castile.
The Kingdom of Castile, right?
What's that?
The Kingdom of Castile, right?
The Kingdom of Castile, yeah. They all had to become Christian.
I think we should also footnote that say it wasn't just Muslims, the Jews were also being treated similarly, or
yes.
Was that slightly even more than that? Or
Well, thank you for pointing that out because it started. What happened was uh, anti. I know some people might take issue with that term anti-Semitism, but so anti-Judaism, let's call it,
Mhm.
um, got an earlier start than Islamophobia in Iberia. It started with pogroms beginning in the late 1300s, and many Jews
So,
converted to Christianity out of fear. Not so
and
much
so
out of
this was in the Christian ruled kingdoms within
yes,
Iberia at that time.
yes. So not in Granada, but like anywhere that Iberia was Christian, which is pretty much by the late 1300s, pretty much anywhere except for Granada.
Right.
Um, so everywhere else besides Granada, it's not that Judaism was officially outlawed, but by this point in time, many Jews convert to Christianity out of fear. Like they were just like trying to survive and not be harassed. And
Right.
then what evolved out of that was like even Jews who converted to Christianity, known as conversos, even that wasn't enough for the church in Spain. Like, because then they got accused of being secret Jews, and well, but secretly they're Judaizing. They're trying to spread their Jewish ways. They're going to go back to their Jewish ways because they still have
Right.
contact with um, their still Jewish co-religionists and their families and what have you. And then by 1492, the same year that Granada fell, Spain gave every Jew who had not converted to Christianity, they had two options: either leave or die. Well, or convert. So I guess three options, three terrible options, right?
Right. And then the conversion was no guarantee of your life and limb either, like you
Correct.
said.
It was absolutely
Right?
no guarantee. I'm just checking the chat and it looks like, okay, no one's commented
Yeah,
yet.
no one's commenting it.
Yeah.
So
Um,
yeah, but go on, get back to that. So
yeah.
this was happening by this point, by the time Granada fell or afterwards,
Mhm.
to both the Jewish populations and the Muslim populations. And finish that thought, and then we'll come back to what the relationship might have been between the two, if you know any of that.
So oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, but I didn't want to interrupt you. I was just adding to the questions of where we might go with this.
Well, so by like the turn of the century, the early 1500s, in the Kingdom of Castile, uh, Muslims could no longer publicly be Muslim, right?
Hmm.
And then that's where you get in Oran, Algeria, they passed a fatwa about taqiyya,
Taqiyya,
um,
right?
which is basically it's saying like if it's a matter of life or death, then a Muslim can pretend to be something else, in this case, Catholic, on the outside. They can fake
Right.
it as long as like they still have Islam in their hearts.
Right. And to introduce that to our listeners and viewers, taqiyya is a concept that is wider than that even, right? The idea of if your life and limb is threatened, you can lie, basically, is the
Yeah,
point. It's okay to lie, it's
yeah,
okay to do that. We have some traditions in South Asia of under very extreme persecution of Shias, some
yeah.
Shias, and there's a serious concept, and like you're saying, bigotry turns up in all its forms, and in some cases Shias will pretend not to be Shia.
I think Taqiyya might have evolved with Shias
It
initially.
is more common in that community because they've
Yeah.
been persecuted in various even Muslim
Yes.
lands for being Shia, right?
Right. Right.
So
Right.
the
Right.
theology behind it comes from there.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up. I think, although that's not the focus of what I'm studying,
Right.
um, that could be a fascinating tangent to go off of for a different
It's yeah.
podcast on the
You know,
similarities between.
and the idea is the basic concept, the theology behind it,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. The parallels kind of between like Taqiyya for Muslims who just like had to convert to a different religion altogether, and
Hmm.
taqiyya among Muslims, like in this case, Shias, who
Hmm.
couldn't like openly be Shia for fear of persecution
Right.
by other Muslims.
And that happened in history. Again, people make sweeping comments about, oh, it's always this way or that, but there were instances of each of these things.
Yeah.
Anyway, coming back to Granada, you were saying so that you were completing the history of what went as Castile became established, and basically it was a process of these little kingdoms coming together and growing till they took on the shape of modern Spain. Right,
Right.
is
Right.
more or less what happened.
Yeah. Um, and so by this point in time, eventually it would spread to Aragon, which is, when Ferdinand and Isabella got married, it was Ferdinand of Aragon, Isabella
Right.
of Castile. They get married and they kind of unite the whole peninsula except for Portugal, right?
Except for
Into
Portugal.
Spain, into the Kingdom of Spain.
And
And
initially, except for Granada, which they then they conquered together, right?
yes.
Oh, yeah.
And even like the whole capitulations, like those were signed in Granada. And Ferdinand and Isabella they would spend much of the year at the Alhambra, which got turned into like the royal residence for the monarchs in
Right.
Granada.
Right. And at that point, before that, it was a mosque. It was a major mosque. Was it mosque or a
Well, the
palace?
Alhambra was like the palace for the
Hmm.
Nasrids. I mean, yeah, there was a masjid in there, but it was like really almost an entire city upon itself,
Right.
on the hill.
Citadel.
Yeah, it was a city unto itself.
Right.
Yeah, it's amazing to explore. Um, but yeah, so at this point in time, what you had is like you have Muslim. It's still Muslim majority Granada, except well now they're Moriscos, right? They're Muslims who were forcibly converted to Christianity.
Right. And that was the term used for the Jews. There's another term, right? The
Converso.
conversos, and then the Muslims they converted called Moriscos.
Yeah, yeah. And what's interesting is, I mean, the rules got more repressive over time. Like Muslims
Mhm.
or Moriscos, they can't speak Arabic. They can only speak Castilian.
Mhm.
Um, they have to go to mass. They can't, they can't go to Juma. They can't pray namaz. They can't
Right.
fast for Ramadan. And like, how do the Inquisition authorities know if they're fasting? Well, because during the daylight hours, if they're not lighting fires, then like
Mhm.
that must mean they're fasting.
They're
Just
not cooking.
so yeah, so their entire private lives became surveilled by the
Right.
Inquisition,
And
right?
ironically, as happens with minorities in other places, their lives are more policed in a harder way than than the majorities and other people like that.
Always. Um, yeah, but I should also point out that at this point in time, up until the 1560s, the Inquisition was more hell bent on persecuting witches, Lutherans, and conversos. Because, like, remember, Jews who had converted to Christianity were allowed to stay, but that they were still being accused of Judaizing.
Right.
And many were burned at the stake and
Basically,
treated just
they
horribly.
they were being accused of being in the taqiyya themselves, right?
Yeah,
That concept.
exactly. So at this point in time, up until the 1560s, the Moriscos, the Inquisition's policy with the Moriscos was more about evangelizing. Like it's kind of like we've given you this grace period. Like come on, we're being so charitable with you. Use this grace period wisely, and come to Christianity. Like the Inquisition thought they were doing the Moriscos a favor.
Hmm. Right.
And then by the 1560s, they initially the monarchs had issued a pragmatic in 1526, which like was like basically like cultural genocide, like no speaking Arabic. They had to close down
The,
their
the, prag-
bathhouses.
the pragmatic was a kind of law,
A
or
law.
what in other contexts we'd call a farman, right?
Uh-huh.
Basically, an announcement telling people what to do.
Yeah. And so, but actually the Moriscos were able to petition the monarchs and get them to suspend the pragmatic for 40 years. So 40 years later, in 1566, they reissued it. The monarchs reissued the pragmatic with a vengeance. So
Wow.
like by this point, the Moriscos couldn't even like women couldn't wear henna, couldn't wear mehndi on their hands, right?
Wow.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah, you hear about it, but the details and the mechanics are fascinating.
Yes. Yes. And another detail I read is that as so Granada was kind of like, it almost reminds me of like the West Bank a bit at this point. Like after 1492, the Castilian monarchs invited Christian settlers to come down to Granada, right? And they were given all sorts of incentives to come settle in Granada. So what you have is this Christian settler minority and a persecuted Muslim Morisco majority.
Right.
It's a powder keg, right?
Yeah, no, and that's a push and pull that continues. So going into the details,
Yes.
uh, you, I know, have been working. One of your focuses is language. Like me, you're interested in language. So you've been talking about these fascinating things, and I wanted to ask you, what is that word that is used for Spanish written in an Arabic script, and then the vice versa, and then Hebrew and its variations?
Alhamiado is
Alhamiado.
it's Spanish written in Arabic letters.
So, but that would have existed before the Christian Reconquista, so to speak. No.
No, I mean, it was germinating, but it really surged after the Reconquista.
So, but then they were writing things in Arabic script. Wouldn't they be told not to do that, not to use the script? And
because this was how they were trying to preserve their Arabic knowledge and their Quranic knowledge any way they could, and this is how they did it.
So their excuse was, we are doing Arabic. It's just a different. Well, we are speaking Spanish, different script.
Yeah, and also by this point, even with speaking Arabic was outlawed, so it's kind of like they're speaking a Spanish that was forced onto them, and obviously there's like some Spanish Arabic mashup, right?
Right, and that happens in every space where cultures.
In every space, but in this particular context, it's a forced mashup.
Right.
They were forced to like become Castilian and speak Castilian. But the way they still wanted to like secretly preserve their Islam. And so what they did was they would write this kind of mutated Spanish that they're speaking, but they would write it out in Arabic. And what I'm finding is that in Alhamiado, they would write they would write these Spanish words in Arabic, but according to the rules of tajweed. And I'm so sorry I don't have an exact example with me, but they would write the Arabic letters abiding by the rules of tajweed.
So phonetically, more or less.
Yes.
So there would be sort of a phonetic Arabic. Yeah, no, I can see that. We do that with, we have these internet memes where we, of English expressions written in Urdu or things like that. So it's kind of and of course, in everyday life, a lot of us, especially those of us without a formal education in Urdu, we write Urdu or other languages in Roman script, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing till the keyboards came around. That's what we do with texting or emails.
Right. Right.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It was really this process of like stripping a person of what makes a person, their religion and their identity and their language.
Yeah, that was a process. And I loved how you often make these parallels, because it sort of brings us back to what other things that are happening around the world now. Like you said, sometimes it's forced, sometimes it's one culture merging or melding into another.
Yeah.
And so, but I also want to go back to, so you had Alhamiado, which is Spanish written in Arabic script. And I know before this, under Muslim rule, a lot of work was done on Christian topics, on Jewish topics. A lot of major rabbis were living under Muslim rule in Andalus. I think Maimonides started out that way and then moved over to who did he either moved over to Ottoman Turkey or Italy, I'm not sure.
Egypt, maybe, or
it might be
somewhere further east. Yeah.
Right. So, but the point was, there's an interesting thing about, I know there are original texts that are actually written in Arabic script, right? I mean, Maimonides' own given name sounds like an Arabic. It's Musa bin Mamun or something, right?
Yeah.
But so have you looked at some of that, about how some of the Hebrew work was done in Arabic script, and was that a more, again, to play a little bit of devil's advocate, were they being forced or pressured into working in the Arabic script, or were they choosing because that was their dominant script in that space?
I think it's more the latter. The reason why I say this is because, like, Sephardic Jews in Spain spoke and they wrote Ladino. And what do I mean by that? Like, Okay,
Right.
they spoke Ladino, which is like their own like version of Spanish, right? And
Hmm.
the way they wrote Ladino, it was like Jewish alhamiado. They wrote Spanish in Hebrew letters.
Spanish in Hebrew. So they wrote Ladino in Hebrew letters, basically.
Right. But the thing is, Ashkenazi Jews, Yiddish, right?
Hmm.
Yiddish is this Germanic language
Yiddish is the
written in
German equivalent of that.
but written in Hebrew letters. And that
Mhm.
wasn't because, I mean, yes, Ashkenazi Jews have been like horribly persecuted for centuries, but it wasn't because they had to hide being Jewish and publicly be Christian. That it
Mm.
just kind of evolved that way, that they wrote
Right.
their everyday vernacular language in the alphabet of their
Right.
sacred language,
No,
right?
and they weren't prevented from using that alphabet either. It was
They weren't,
one
yeah,
of
and they
those.
weren't prevented from using their alphabet. Whereas what I'm reading with the Moriscos is it's more like what they spoke prior to 1492 was in this book I'm reading. It describes as let me see if I can pronounce it. Algarabia. So like um it's probably most similar to Moroccan Arabic. So it's Arabic, but it's um, marinated in this Iberian milieu for centuries and just taken on a life of its own.
Right,
But
of course.
that became outlawed after, by the early 1500s. Like, no, there's only one language and it's Castilian Spanish.
Right, and
Right?
that's the other thing. These languages that we have today, Spanish, English, they're all standardized on one dialect, right? Like English standardized on the London dialect, not even London, the court dialect. Uh,
Right, right.
and
Southwest England,
Urdu,
right?
for example, has standardized on specifically either Lucknow or Delhi. Those dialects have
Mm-hmm.
become what in Urdu we call it Pakki Boli, right? The more set language
Mm-hmm.
is the formalization of one specific dialect. Uh, and by the way, for my curiosity, modern Spanish comes from that Castilian dialect, or where does that come from?
Does I mean, and even in Spain to this day, I mean, you got
Mm.
Andalusian Spanish and Valencian Spanish and Extremadura Spanish, right?
So yeah, so before we move on, and I'm cutting you off, but so you have now started. Tell us a bit about your work at the GTU. What have you been studying? And then I know you've taken a field trip or two out to Spain
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
and that region.
Yeah. So initially, I first started off as a master's student, and I took well, it's definitely getting a lot of buzz now, but critical race theory. The course was called like critical race theory, which I know Republicans have since.
So you were studying critical race theory before it was really cool.
Yeah, yeah. And then I wrote a paper about how how do I put this? Like how Muslims were racialized in Spain. Because for all intents and purposes, that's what this
Mm.
was. This was racialization.
Right,
It's
right.
it's um
Yeah, and so in fact, I'd like to hear some of that your thought. What were the underlying? Because there's a lot of African folks, people I grew up with, who now think of the Moorish presence in Spain as an African presence, right? And which it was because it came from Morocco. But
mhm.
that you're saying there was Muslims weren't one ethnic group before that, or
I mean, it's like this. Like the very first Muslims to arrive in Iberia, like it was a minority of Arabs, and even
right?
that meaning like from Arabia, but also Syria and Iraq, right? Like just
Tariq bin,
from the east.
you're talking about the earlier Tariq bin Ziyad and
Yes,
Zayd.
yeah, yeah. But even with Tariq ibn Ziyad, I think he himself was Berber. The majority of the Muslims who went, who crossed over with Tariq ibn Ziyad, they were Berber. And
Right,
even in North Africa, historically they spoke Berber and Latin. There's a lot of Latin Roman
right,
influence.
from the Roman times.
Yeah. Um, so, but you got to realize, over many centuries, it's not like it was just this Arab Berber endogamous transplant for 800 years. Obviously
Hmm.
they intermarried with the locals.
Right,
Local Christian Iberians converted to Islam for a variety of different reasons.
right.
And even like 200 years later, as you got like more and more locals who converted to Islam, that's how Islam became indigenized to Iberia.
To
The vast
Iberia.
majority of the Muslims in Al Andalus, they were local Christians who converted to Islam.
And then you're saying after 1492, they started to be treated as one group and therefore one
Yes,
racial and ethnic group.
right, right. And what's interesting is they were treated kind of both ways. On one hand, like Arabs, they are the
Hmm.
Arabs,
The
but really the
Moors, I
correct term would
believe.
be like the Arabized uh, locals, the Arabized natives, if you
Hmm.
will. But on the
Okay.
other hand, because even up until 1492, you had Muslims in Granada who like were descended, like maybe their parents had converted from Christianity to Islam, or their grandparents. Like, so in other words, like they were,
It was
they
a
were recent converts.
it was a process over several hundred years, and therefore, you know,
Right.
three
It's not like
generations to
it's
the
not like just in one
century,
generation they converted and then it stayed frozen in time. Like there were people converting
right?
throughout.
Intermarrying, converting, becoming this and that. So there was, but you're saying the actual ethnization or racialization of them happened around that time under pressure from the Reconquista.
Yeah. So it's like on one hand they were treated like oh, they're not from here, like they're Arabs and they speak
Outside.
Arabic. But on the other hand, like especially with um the Muslims who were just like maybe they had like a Christian um they the monarchs kind of use this reasoning of like, come on, why don't you go back to Christianity like what your parents were, right? um
Right. No, that's understandable. And the thing is, listening to you, and we all talk about this, and I know, even, and I'll say this critically, Western Muslims particularly want to think about that whole thing, and our more emotional brothers and sisters often have this discussion of, oh, they idealize Al-Andalus, and the whole, there's an idealization of it, but don't often get this level of mechanics on it. What happened? What could people do? Uh, how did they convert? What did the languages go? And which, before we end this for today at least,
yeah,
what happened at the other end? Because we go from where they were gradually being wiped out to, by the time the 20th century rolled around, and a new wave of immigrants starts hitting Europe, there were no Muslims in Spain, right? All cultural or even physical, markers of the Moriscos were pretty much gone, right?
yeah,
Because now we're talking 500 years, 500 years
right.
later.
So you have a permanent like interruption of indigenous Iberian Islam. I would argue that after the Moriscos were expelled between 1609 and 1614, the remnants of Islam went into the shadows, because you can't really just wipe out a culture like, oh, it's never here. Nope, completely obliterated. But it kind of manifested in, like, for example, flamenco, right? You
Hmm.
have, yeah, you have flamenco, you have even right up until the Moriscos were kicked out, they would leave pages of Arabic writing and pages of surahs scattered in their homes, so that it would make so that the entire Quran couldn't be confiscated by the Inquisition. They would hide a lot of stuff
Oh, right.
in their walls. And I think what you had over time is you had vestiges of Islam pushed deeper and deeper and deeper into the shadows until the descendants of Moriscos who somehow avoided expulsion forgot who they were and forgot why they do the things that they do,
Hmm.
like washing up to their elbows and washing their face before they eat, like doing like
Hmm.
wuzu like actions before they
Right.
eat.
It was, yeah, and then of course there's the linguistic influence and the place names. One of the
Right.
biggest ironies being Fatima, which is a huge Catholic shrine, is named
Mm.
for Bibi Fatima. And
Yeah.
always we all get curious about, why is it called that? And we don't even often discuss it. But at one point when I looked at it, it sounds like it was a coincidence. The city, for historical reasons, happened to be named Fatima. And
Right.
then, but when the events that happened in the early 20th century
Mhm.
of the chronicles and the visions of Our Lady
Right.
became, Our Lady of Fatima is a whole order within the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Uh, So the language thing, to me, that's the fascinating part. And then, of course, expressions, letters, there are, little words people point out. There's a version of the Alhamdulillah and MashaAllah actually built into the Spanish language.
Hmm.
A lot of the place names and the influence comes over to the New World, Mexico, California.
Hmm.
Every city has a major Alameda. It
Hmm.
has an Alhambra and things like that. So the names, the attitudes, the linguistic influence, it's there. It's all
Yeah.
there.
And
So,
also a lot of crypto Muslims and crypto Jews, they did escape Spain and go to the Americas. And they would, I mean,
hmm,
even though officially they had to be like old Christians, meaning they couldn't have any Jewish or Muslim ancestry, but a lot of them, they bribed officials and they falsified documentation to prove that they're old Christians. And that's how they were able to go to the Americas.
also, there was actually a filter, as in Moriscos aren't allowed to be part of those.
Yeah, yeah. And they
Oh,
didn't even
wow.
want Roma or gypsies going,
Right.
but
Mhm.
they went anyway.
Yeah, of course.
People found all kinds of ways to get around the
Humanity,
regulations. Yeah,
humanity finds its way.
of
So, yeah.
course.
And so, anyway, so this, I would look at the conversation we were just having as sort of an introductory, uh, you know, conversation, and we don't want to go too long.
Hmm.
And we'll come back to this with more, I'll have more well-formed questions. And
Yeah,
if you don't mind, I would like to check back on you as your, educational journey continues. I know COVID threw us all for loops. Uh,
yeah,
we're all still settling in, and then we can talk about some of these. At the one side you say Morisco, I find that a balance with the word mustaribun, which is people who are Arabized, right?
right. Well, that's
Uh,
like you got Mozarab, and in
hmm.
Al Andalus, a Mozarab was a an Iberian who remained Christian, but they were Arabized.
Oh,
So like,
culturally.
yeah, like their religion was Christianity, but like culturally they spoke Arabic, and maybe their name was like um so and so Ibn Mardanish, which is like
Right.
an Arabization of Martinez.
Right. Musa bin Mamun. I mean, the Jews had those kind of names, right? Maimonides, his given name was more, it was an Arabic formulation.
Yeah,
Maimonides is the modern version of that. It was Musa. And of course, there was his Jewish name, which was Moshe ben,
yeah,
Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon or something.
yeah. Now it's interesting. Like even I mean, Christianity in Al Andalus or in the whole peninsula is not a monolith because yes, you had Mozarabs, you had like Arabized Christians, but then you had a holdout of Christians who didn't either they just didn't Arabize or they didn't want to Arabize and they actually resisted Arabization. And that kind of those were like the seeds of what would become like the Inquisition and intolerant Christianity, if you will. So even,
Right.
so even like Mozarabs, no, those aren't real Christians. Those aren't true
And
Catholics.
they must have felt that pressure as well, especially as the Reconquista took hold. So
Yeah.
yeah, fascinating here. I think we should call it a day. It's a little over half an hour.
Okay.
And we'll come back and take this further, and I'll have questions and the concepts and the languages, and it's just a fascinating part of the world. And of course, history. That question about why do we study history? Well, we study history because it informs our present, and where do we go from here?
Yeah.
And you drew some parallels with the West Bank. I was drawing parallels to what happened in South Asia, and
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, and that's kind of the thing to reiterate here also for our audiences. We're not here to like pick on any religion or faith or community. We're trying to understand the humanity of it, and these things have gone each way back and
Yeah.
forth.
Yeah. I think
They've
what's
gone
pretty scary, speaking of parallels to South Asia, is you have the rise of the BJP, and you
right
have
currently.
some Hindus. I definitely don't want to generalize and say all because they're definitely not a monolith, but I think you have some Hindus who probably want to do what the Catholic Church did in Spain, was like kind of rewrite history
Yeah, no,
and
no,
like try to
right,
either Muslims but also any vestiges of Islam,
right, and
downplay
it's
the
not.
influence of the Mughals.
You use the word probably. It's no longer a probably, right? There's
It is.
literal happenings. Things are happening. They want to. There's discussions about what building was built where on top of what, and that whole
Right.
thing.
Right.
And more importantly, there has been a very subtle absorption, because I was trying not to interrupt you, and I
Mhm.
know I fail at that, but that whole discussion about how nomenclature and names and considering people outsiders. I mean, one side of my family
Mhm.
claims to have been in South Asia for over 1,000 years now,
Mhm.
or about 1,000 years. The other side, even in their most, the claim of high genealogy, one claims about 500-600 years, the other claims 1,000 years. When you think about 1,000 years, a
Mhm.
1,000 years ago, I can guarantee you, even some of the most traditionally Hindu families were in what is now South Asia. I
Right.
mean, what do you do with that? And then we compare it to, say, the West, or we're talking 1300s, 1400s, 1500s.
Mhm.
The first independent Muslim kingdom in South Asia was 1000 AD, right?
Mm.
I mean, Britain wasn't Protestant or even Anglo-Saxon at that point,
Right.
barely, right? That's how deep the roots go in one place, which is
Yeah.
not. And that's coming out. That's coming out in the wash in India. Terminology, the word invader is used. I've challenged
Yeah.
very good Hindu friends on
Yes.
their use of the word invader. I'm like, I know you don't agree with that Mohammedan narrative. Why are you reusing terminology that privileges or accepts that narrative?
Yeah.
And that's what you see happening in. That's why it was fascinating to me here about Mozaribun and Mostaribun. Other people who are Arabized and Christians who aren't, or that whole discussion is, as I say, history might not repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes.
Yeah.
uh,
That's a really good way to put it.
and so, yeah, but folks, we are going to sign off here. Thank you, Laura.
Yes. Will
And
this be replayed, or is it just like it's a
this is
live,
going
like
out
one and done?
this is going out live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, as I
Okay.
said, and
Okay.
therefore by definition available for watching after that.
Okay,
Liking,
great.
posting, retweeting. I'll send you links and maybe even send out a note, and
Okay.
we'll take it from there.
All right. And then
Well,
my
thank you, folks.
hottie also wants to say some
Oh,
hello.
yes, we have to talk to you about these guys.
Yes. That'll
You,
be for another podcast, but this is my
your
BFF.
your other passion,
Yes. She has
and
nothing to do with Al Andalus, but she's my good friend, my
well,
elephant.
elephants keep turning up in that region. By the way, goes back to Carthage.
Yes.
The whole discussion about elephants over the Alps and all of that. Uh, anyway,
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Sabaha. Thank you for having me.
I'm sorry I got a little disconnected there, but anyway,
That's all right.
good
I
to
said,
see you,
yes, I said, thank you for having me. Sorry, we got disconnected, and good to see
and
you.
we'll come back to with notes and questions.
I think you cut out.
Sorry, I
You
deserve.
cut out.
But we'll follow up with all of these things and uh, learn from you as you take your journey to a more serious, more academic study of Al-Andalus. I have to tell you one last thing. I was in grad school back in the 90s, and we were studying a course in rhetorical theory, which goes back to the Greeks and all that. And we were told
Yeah.
projects, right? So my interest was working on Avicenna and his influence on the West. And on the other side, we had this one lady who was of Spanish descent,
Mm.
a Jewish background herself,
Hmm.
and she was trying to study Spain, right? And discussing, you know, how some types of ideology and theology developed in Spain. But in everything she said, there was no mention of the fact that the space she was talking about was a Muslim space, at
Interesting.
least in terms of being ruled by Muslims. So it was all about in Spain, this developed and that evolved, with
Huh.
no mention of the influence, no acknowledgement of. And to me, it's also important because there was a lot of cross pollination happening.
Absolutely.
My thesis is modern rabbinical Judaism, modern, especially mystical Christianity,
Hmm.
and the Sufi schools
Yes.
all have roots, and at least one strong root in Al Andalus. Ibn Arabi was a Spaniard for the, in one manner of speaking. And he is considered, one of the earliest of our Sufi masters, right?
Right.
And on the other hand, Maimonides and other people developed their Kabbalah, it's not a coincidence that Sufism, Kabbalah, and mystical Christianity, the mysticism in Christianity, were all evolving and coming of age in that space at that time. It's
That's
not a
right.
coincidence. They were, and you watch some of the religious and spiritual YouTubers on the internet. They will talk about it now. But I went to grad school 20, 30 years ago, so things are getting better. We're talking more openly about the cross pollination and the learning that every culture has done from each other and developed in parallel. They were sisters coming up in that space. Anyway, I got off on a rant again. I
Yes.
will now switch back to our basic thing. And folks, so you saw that this is the nature and tradition and spirit in which we want to have some of these conversations. Please like, comment, like, repost, subscribe to each of these platforms: Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And we will come back to you with other interesting things. One other last thing, you will see in our title, we have the letters EN in square brackets. That's because on this platform, on the iFakir platform, we do Arabic, we do both English and Urdu primarily. So you will see an EN or a UR, which helps you understand which language, what is the main language of a specific conversation. And hopefully, my Punjabi is not that strong, and I can speak a little. My Let me say, put it like this: my Hausa is rusty, my Punjabi is not very strong, and my German is rudimentary. But you are welcome to interact with us with any of those languages, and we will try to get you more content from there. And for now, take care, assalamu alaikum, and all the best.